topic tonight is where is Russia headed? Implications for U.S.-Russia relations. And our guest is David J. Kramer, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Mr. Kramer is a graduate of Tufts in political science and Soviet studies. His master's degree is from Harvard in Soviet studies. He's taught at Clark University. He was an analyst with the Wall Street Journal during the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's been at major think tanks. He's at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Project for the New American Century, and the Center for Strategic and International Relations. At the State Department, he's been a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Problems. He's been a member of the policy planning staff at the State Department, and now in his current position, he is responsible directly for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and for non-proliferation matters as well. It's a fascinating position. Nobody has to be told that the Soviet Union is hugely important to us, could be a tremendous friend, a bother, perhaps, on other occasions. And we all have been witnessing Mr. Putin's interesting behavior and comments about the United States. Today's paper noted that he was going to spend some time in Kennebunkport in July, which impressed me. We go to Kennebunk Beach, which is right across the river, which it isn't like being from the other side of the tracks, but it's the other side of the river in any case. And so whenever the Bushes have these well-known people, those who are in the area are most interested. But it didn't take, and wonderful as that sounds, it didn't take Mr. Putin a half a day to say something nasty about the United States, of course, as we know. In any case, Mr. Putin's behavior is of great interest to us on a serious level. The Soviet Union could be tremendously important to us, as well as a danger of a kind of Russia details. I'm thinking of Mr. Putin and getting confused about all of this. He did say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a great catastrophe, of course. So that wasn't a terrible mistake, but certainly a mistake, Bob. But in any case, it's my enormous pleasure to have with us this evening a man who's directly responsible at the State Department for Russia, Mr. David J. Kramer.
Frank, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here in front of such an impressive turnout on a rather hot, humid day in Baltimore. It's the same in Washington, let me tell you. And I do appreciate that you've closed these blinds, because otherwise I think I'd catch myself staring out there at the terrific view. It's great that so many of you have turned out in such numbers to hear someone speak on U.S.-Russian relations, which is a difficult subject, full of nuances and details, and now devoid of the comforts of black and white absolutes. Russia is no longer, as President Ronald Reagan once famously said, the evil empire. Let me start with that assertion. In fact, over the last 15+ years, Russia has become more free than at any time in its history. But let me hasten to add that that is an incredibly low threshold to hold Russia to. Far too low for a great nation like that. Far too low for Russia's own aspirations to greatness, and far short of our own hopeful and, yes, perhaps giddy, even unrealistic expectations of 16 years ago, when the world was encouraged by the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Russia does give us pause. It gives pause to those who follow its evolution with interest, like all of you, to those who would want to invest there or do business with it, which probably includes a number of you here in this audience this evening, and to those of us who deal with it diplomatically, like me. Just yesterday, as Frank mentioned, the White House announced that President Bush will host President Putin July 1st and 2nd, at the Bush family compound in Kennebunkport. And given the tendency of pundits to look for a quick explanation, we've already seen the meeting described as everything from a kiss and make up weekend to a trip to the woodshed. In the world in which we really live, I think it's more likely to be a chance for the two leaders to get some issues on the table, agree on some, disagree on others. Now let me move to a disclaimer of sorts. As Frank mentioned, the part of the title of the speech is, "Where is Russia headed?" So before going on any further, I should warn you that if I could reliably predict the future, I wouldn't be here today. With the wealth I would have earned, I would either be the owner of the Boston Red Sox, my hometown team, no disrespect to the Orioles, or at least doing laudatory volunteer work somewhere. As former Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, now Russia's ambassador to Ukraine, once famously said, "Predictions are hard, especially about the future." And yes, predicting the future is hard, especially when it comes to Russia. And better men than I have crashed on those shoals. In 1982, for example, the noted late historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. warned that, and I quote, "Those in the United States who think the Soviet Union is on the verge of economic and social collapse are wishful thinkers who are only kidding themselves." James Reston, noted columnist of the New York Times, wrote 3 years later in 1985 that the Soviet Union was no closer to collapse than the US because, quote, "it is clear that the ideologies of communism, socialism, and capitalism are all in trouble." And in 1989, barely months before the Soviet Union finally broke up, MIT economist Paul Samuelson, a noted Nobel laureate no less, said, quote, "The Soviet economy is proof that a socialist command economy can function and even thrive." So ladies and gentlemen, I guess what I'm trying to say is I won't be peering into my crystal ball here tonight. Rather, I will try to address with you the here and now and how we see things. And believe me, that will be a complicated enough task. First, a little background. My immediate boss, Daniel Fried, the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs at the State Department, likes to say that Russia's relations with the West have been problematic since Peter the Great, who was the Tsar at the turn of the century, the turn of the 17th century, that is. One can go even further back in history and say that Russia's foreign relations have been prickly since Ivan the Terrible, in many ways the founder of Russia in the mid-1500s. US relations with Moscow go back less than that, of course, but still a long way, and they've had their ups and downs. Official diplomatic relations are 200 years old this year, as diplomatic notes were exchanged in 1807. 2 years later, our future sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, a native of Massachusetts, by the way, arrived in St. Petersburg to present his credentials as our first ambassador to Tsar Alexander I in 1809. Many people don't realize that back then, Russia was our #1 trading partner. And many people may also not know that whatever the disagreements we have on some important issues, and I don't mean to minimize them, our business with Russia today is also very important. Any assessment of where we are bilaterally has to take this business component into account. While the latest figures aren't in yet, we know that US investment in Russia shot up by 50% in 2005. Many of our top companies are interested in increasing their stake in the Russian Federation, including such mainstays of our economy as Alcoa, International Paper, Coca-Cola, GM, Procter & Gamble, which employs more than 20,000 Russians, and Boeing, which employs 1,300 Russians, and last year signed an $18 billion, that's right, billion with a B, deal to buy titanium from Russia. And just the other day, Boeing initialed a contract valued at as much as $2.4 billion with Russia's second largest airline, S7, for the purchase of at least 15 long-range jets. Many firms that vowed they'd never go back to Russia after the 1998 financial meltdown are damn glad they did, for the Russian market has been an incredibly lucrative one in recent years. And these horizons will increasingly broaden once Russia joins the World Trade Organization. It is estimated that WTO accession leads to a several billion-dollar jump in foreign direct investment in the very first year of membership alone. The World Bank estimates that the boost to Russia's GDP from accession would be around 3%. This on top of a Russian economy that's already doing very well. And I give you these figures as a way of background and the history to put the present in its proper context. The reality of our relationship today is it is multifaceted, even very complicated, and every criticism we have of Russia has to be understood within the following paradigm. We want Russia to be a partner with us in the world. In fact, we want Russia to be strong, and by that we mean with a strong democratic and independent institution base, both in and out of government. That includes a strong civil society, free press, an active opposition, genuine elections with real competition between candidates, and a pluralistic political scene backed up and supported by strong and independent middle and entrepreneurial classes. Those like you who are interested in our relationship with Russia should bear in mind that we do not exempt Russia from our belief in the universal potential of freedom. And we also have Russia in mind when we say that we seek an open world characterized by partnerships with like-minded countries. The result of this view is our policy to Russia, which is this: cooperate wherever we can, push back whenever we have to, and if you're looking for a bumper sticker of our Russia policy, that's it. Our preferred approach, naturally, is cooperation, always seeking to expand the scope of that collaboration where our interests overlap. We push back when we must. We do so privately, when possible, but publicly when necessary, in defense of our values, our national interests, and our friends. And it is in that spirit that I was disappointed to read reports today of rather provocative comments by Mr. Putin during a press conference in Moscow just a few hours ago, in which he accused the United States of starting an arms race and used the words diktat and imperialism to describe our interest in developing a missile defense shield in Europe. In all our endeavors, at all points, we work with our European allies and friends to coordinate our approaches and articulate the common values underlying our policies. And let me sketch out for you today, briefly I hope, the areas where we do cooperate, the areas where we have some disagreements, and those areas in between. And let me start with the first group, areas of cooperation. And here, I'll mention counterterrorism, non-proliferation. In particular, I have in mind dealing with Iran and North Korea, nuclear cooperation, and trade and investment. We've also done well in areas of space exploration, cooperation in health, fighting global diseases, environmental cooperation. To be sure, the overlap is not perfect if you think in terms of a Venn diagram, but we have made progress, and it's important to say so. In the second group, involving differences between us, it is impossible not to mention Russia's relations with its neighbors, where we have seen outright bullying of those who have expressed pro-Western tendencies. Inside Russia, there has also been a worrisome slide in an anti-democratic direction. I will also talk about our differences over the issue of missile defense, CFE, and Kosovo. And in the middle, the third category, we need to mention energy security. And I put this in the middle because we are eager to work with Russia, a country that has vast resources of energy supplies, and Russia may also want to work with us. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Let me first turn to the important areas where we work well with Russia. And first among these should be in the area of counterterrorism. This is an area of solid cooperation, and our intelligence services have useful exchanges with each other. President Bush and President Putin announced the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism at last year's G8 summit. We will meet again in a few months to continue and deepen cooperation on intelligence, law enforcement, weapons of mass destruction, terrorist financing, counter-narcotics, the problems in Afghanistan, issues at the United Nations involving terrorist designations, the issue of manpads, which are dangerous anti-aircraft missiles we try to keep out of the hands of terrorists, and transportation security. Nuclear cooperation and non-proliferation cooperation are also in the positive category, and here we're making good progress. We are negotiating, for example, what is called a 1-2-3 agreement, which promotes civilian nuclear energy cooperation. Under the START Treaty and the Treaty of Moscow, 7,000 nuclear warheads have been deactivated. 600 ICBMs and 600 SLBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles have been destroyed. Last year, together with Moscow, we renewed until 2013, the year 2013, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, known as CTR, which was launched in 1992 to facilitate dismantlement of weapons of mass destruction in the former Soviet Union. We in Russia have agreed to accelerate some elements of this. Nuclear security upgrades are on track for completion, for example, by the end of 2008. With the expiration of the START Treaty in 2009, we have begun positive discussions about a post-START arrangement. And there have been several high-level visits to Moscow, as you undoubtedly have seen in recent months, including those of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. We share with Russia many common global non-proliferation goals. We work closely with Russia and others to address the nuclear ambitions of North Korea and Iran. Moscow has sometimes voiced disagreement with our approach to sanctions and other measures, but for the most part, these are more tactical differences. We share the same goals, keeping Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. Russia voted for the UN Security Council resolutions 1718 on North Korea and 1737 and 1747 on Iran. And these resolutions respectively called for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and imposing Chapter 7 sanctions on North Korea, as well as imposing sanctions against Iran until Tehran suspends its nuclear enrichment program and comes into compliance with non-proliferation treaty obligations. All I can say is that we look forward to the full implementation of these UN resolutions. On trade and investment, as I mentioned earlier, we have a growing relationship. We support Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization. And conclusion of our bilateral agreement last November was an important step forward. We look to Russia to implement its obligations under this agreement, especially on intellectual property rights and market access for agricultural trade. Progress on these issues since we signed the bilateral agreement, I have to tell you, has been frustratingly slow. But we nevertheless support Russia's entry into rules-based international systems. That is good for everyone. The United States government also continues to support Jackson Vanik graduation for Russia. And I should add that Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Lantos, also recently expressed his support during a visit to Moscow, an important signal given that Congress really holds the key on this particular issue. And the last issue in the areas of cooperation, we continue to pursue cooperation through the NATO-Russia Council, which this year marks its 5th anniversary and will be marking the anniversary next month in Russia. We have a broad range of cooperative NATO-Russia initiatives, and these range from Russian participation in Operation Active Endeavor to counter-narcotics programs in Afghanistan. But there is more we can and should be doing to face common threats and preserve and maintain global security. So overall, as you can see, there are many areas of good cooperation with Russia, and we must always keep these in mind. But since I just referred to NATO-Russia relations, I also need to segue into the second broad area, those issues where, frankly, we have disagreements with Russia. The meeting April 26th of foreign ministers from the NATO-Russia Council in Oslo, Norway, made clear that there are some important differences between Russia on the one hand and NATO allies on the other. You see, President Putin earlier that day, in his State of the Nation address, suggested that he would consider suspending Russia's obligations under the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, known as the CFE Treaty, if no progress was made by NATO allies on ratification of the adapted CFE Treaty. As it usually happens, such saber-rattling by Russia only succeeded in unifying the alliance. In Oslo, NATO ministers universally responded that we continued to regard the current CFE Treaty as a cornerstone of European security. The Bush administration and NATO allies are very serious about our support for adapted CFE. The adapted treaty, signed in 1999, replaces the block-to-block structure of the original treaty with a more flexible system of national and territorial equipment limits. But before we can ratify the adapted CFE, Russia must fulfill its commitments it made in Istanbul in 1999 to withdraw its forces from Georgia and Moldova. At the heart of the adapted CFE treaty lies the clear principle that no state can station and maintain troops on another country's territory without that country's consent. Both Georgia and Moldova have asked Russian forces stationed there to leave, as is their right as sovereign independent states. In Georgia, Russia has made major progress in fulfilling its commitments, but in Moldova, by comparison, it has done nothing since 2003. Absent further progress by Russia in fulfilling these Istanbul commitments, and we have offered to help them, we unfortunately will not be able to move forward on adapted CFE ratification. We also seek to advance cooperation with Russia through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, known as the OSCE. But Russia's attitude toward the OSCE remains a cause for concern. Speaking in February to the Munich Security Conference, President Putin branded the OSCE a, quote, vulgar instrument designed to promote the foreign policy interests of one or a group of countries. Under the guise of demanding reforms and seeking to place more emphasis on security and economic issues, Russia has proposed changes to the OSCE. But let's be clear, the effect of these reforms would be to cripple the OSCE's democracy promotion efforts. The Bush administration strongly defends the OSCE's mandate to advance democratic reforms, including election monitoring. Washington and Moscow committed to these efforts when we both signed the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. The elections monitoring efforts of the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, known as ODIHR, constitute nothing less than the international gold standard in this area. In fact, we look forward to the OSCE's involvement in monitoring the conduct of Russia's upcoming parliamentary elections in December 2007 and Russia's presidential elections in March 2008. And I should add, incidentally, that the United States accepts and welcomes ODIHR monitoring of our own elections. I suppose we can't avoid the fact that differences with Russia over the OSCE reflect negative trends on human rights and democracy inside Russia itself. And we hope that the slide in these areas that we have seen over the past few years will not deepen, and in fact, will reverse itself. Optimists would point to Russia's history of swings of the pendulum, and express hope that things will soon begin to swing in a more positive direction. But we do no one any favors, least of all the Russian people and their own government, by abstaining from speaking out when necessary. We do so, I should point out, as a friend, worried about the trends we see unfolding, not simply to wag our finger in a lecturing way. We also do so as a matter of principle. Suppression of genuine opposition, abridgment of the right to protest, constriction of civil society, and the decline of media freedom are all serious setbacks. They are inconsistent with Russia's professed commitment to building and preserving the foundations of a democratic state. The Department of State has publicly protested the recent police brutality employed to break up opposition marches in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and just the other day in Voronezh. The European Union has also protested these actions. Russian authorities sought to prevent these marches from taking place at all. They denied permission to stage the events or tried to marginalize them by changing their venues. Russian authorities also harassed and detained Russians traveling to these events to protest peacefully. On the day of the events, a disproportionate police presence wielded undue force against protesters as well as journalists reporting on the events. And at the European Union-Russia summit in Samara just a few weeks ago, similar efforts were directed against members of the Russian opposition seeking to express their opinions there. And while there was no crackdown on the march itself in Samara, where several hundred people were allowed to protest, organizers and journalists covering the event faced significant harassment. And this included Russian authorities preventing activists known as Other Russia, including their leader Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, and some 20 others from flying from Moscow to Samara because they may have had quote-unquote counterfeit airline tickets. Again, as with Russian intransigence over CFE and at the OSCE, such ham-fisted behavior has only managed to forge a stronger consensus between us and our allies. The Russian government must simply realize that it does itself no favors when it uses these strong-arm tactics. It was interesting to note that Presidential Administration Deputy Press Spokesman Dmitry Peskov acknowledged that the police response to last month's protest merited review. The governor of St. Petersburg, Matvienko, and the official human rights ombudsman, Vladimir Lukin, have both called for investigations of the handling of these protests. President Putin's own chairperson of the Civil Society Institution and Human Rights Council, Ella Pamfilova, has called for the resignation of the Interior Minister. Such calls indicate that even within official Russia, there is not a monolithic facade on human rights. Having said that, the backsliding is multifaceted. We are concerned about the increasingly narrow and controlled space within which NGOs are forced to operate. We also continue to monitor the implementation of the new NGO law enacted in April 2006. And the increasing pressure on Russian journalists is likewise troubling. Simply put, a vigorous, independent, and probing media is indispensable in a democracy. In Russia today, unfortunately, most national broadcast media, which are the primary source of news for most Russians, are either in the hands of the government or of individuals and entities allied and friendly to the government. And one cannot talk about the state of journalism in Russia without making mention of recent attacks on journalists, including the brutal and still unsolved murders of Paul Klebnikov and Anna Politkovskaya, among others. These brave and talented journalists cared deeply about Russia, wanted to make it a better place, and lost their lives because of those attributes. The Litvinenko case in London, sadly, raises further serious questions about Russia's record. We believe that Litvinenko's murder was a horrible crime that posed a threat to many others who might have been exposed to polonium. And we strongly support British efforts to bring to justice those who perpetrated this dastardly act. That all this is happening, that Russia is regressing in these areas ahead of parliamentary and presidential elections, may not be entirely coincidental. The Kremlin is bringing its full weight to bear in shaping the environment of its preferred outcome. And what is most disturbing is the apparently selective use of the law to disadvantage a number of political parties, for instance, by precluding their registration and thus their ability to put forth candidates. And it's important that you know that the United States and our European allies continue to support Russian democracy and civil society. These issues are regularly taken up in our bilateral and multilateral consultations. Capacity building for civil society and support for the rule of law are key priorities of our assistance programs to Russia. And President Bush, when he was in St. Petersburg last summer, hosted an event with NGO and civil society leaders, sending a powerful message of American support and solidarity. And just this month, during her visit, Secretary Rice took part in Moscow in a roundtable discussion with leaders of civil society and other figures. And because a country's foreign policy can only reflect its internal situation, you should not be surprised to hear that Russia's relations with its neighbors and with Europe remain an issue of considerable concern. And this is another area where we are pushing back. Here's the problem. Moscow still approaches its neighbors with a zero-sum mentality, particularly when it comes to those countries, such as Georgia and Ukraine, which choose to pursue closer Euro-Atlantic ties. Russian-Georgian relations, after a period of extreme tension last fall, have shown tentative signs of improvement, but still remain tense. Russia maintains the economic and transportation sanctions it imposed against Georgia last fall. On the positive side, Russia seems to have resumed issuing visas to Georgians only in the last few days, which, if confirmed, would be a notable step. Yet Russia continues to take actions that call into question its professed support for Georgia's territorial integrity. Moscow, for example, supports separatist regimes in Georgia's breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And Moscow also gives support to the corrupt separatist regime in Moldova's Transnistria region, a regime that has avoided engaging in conflict resolution talks for over a year. And this is an issue I personally have spent lots of time on, including regular visits to Moldova. I should add that on one separatist conflict, the one over Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we and Russia work well together in trying to facilitate a resolution. But in general, the United States continues to call on Russia to end its support for separatists and work with European partners to implement confidence-building measures designed to bring the sides in each conflict closer together. We are working to advance a resolution to all these conflicts. Regrettably, Russia has adopted a hostile attitude toward US plans for placing elements of a limited missile defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic. These systems are intended to shield the United States and its European allies against missile threats from the Middle East, and we have held numerous briefings and consultations with Russia on our missile defense plans for more than a year, both bilaterally and in the NATO-Russia Council. So Russia cannot claim, as it does, that we are not being transparent with them. More than that, we have offered ways to work together in confronting this mutual threat from Iran and rogue regimes, but Russia so far prefers unhelpful rhetoric over actual collaboration. The very modest system we have in mind poses no threat whatsoever to Russia. This is why, speaking at the NATO ministerial meeting in Oslo in April, and again just the other day, Secretary Rice described as, quote, purely ludicrous the idea that somehow 10 interceptors and a few radars in Eastern Europe are a threat to Russia or somehow undermine the effectiveness of Russia's arsenal of thousands of nuclear weapons. test of which a new one was just launched the other day. In fact, what we are trying to do is not even designed to confront a threat from that direction. We and the Russians simply do not agree on missile defense, but we will continue to work to be transparent and to reach a better understanding between our two countries on this important issue. And to round out joint US-European efforts to get Russia to moderate its behavior toward its neighbors, we and our European allies have spoken out against Russia's proclivity to use energy as a political and/or economic lever against neighbors, such as in the case of Ukraine in 2006 or Belarus this year. In both cases, we spoke out clearly against cutoffs of Russian energy to these countries and encouraged resolution of differences by transparent commercial means over a gradual period of time. Hastily shutting down oil and/or gas flows to neighbors in the middle of winter, and in the process disrupting supply to other European countries further downstream, is damaging to Russia's reputation as a reliable supplier of energy resources and is not an effective way to bolster global energy security. We are concerned by apparently political interference with infrastructure, as in the case of prolonged repairs to an oil pipeline to Lithuania, or the closing of Russia's only legal border crossing with Georgia last year, or alleged structural deficiencies that restricted traffic on a bridge to Estonia this month. The recent cyber warfare against Estonia is additional cause for concern. Restricting traffic to Estonia is but one example of a heavy-handed approach toward that country and is the most recent cause for concern about Russian behavior toward its neighbors. And this reference to energy brings me to my last point, which is in the area in the middle, the energy security basket. Russia, as you may know, holds the world's largest natural gas reserves, the second largest coal reserves, and the 7th largest oil reserves. It is the largest exporter of natural gas, and it is tied with Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil exporter. Energy is literally fueling Russia's economic growth and growing Russian confidence and assertiveness. At the same time, however, Russia's energy industry is plagued by decaying infrastructure and requires significant investment to maintain current production levels. We are concerned about the trends here too, and the Russian government will need to address its decision to exert more state control over strategic industries. Our bilateral energy dialogue was launched with high hopes in 2003, and there were some results, such as the ConocoPhillips-Lukoil deal, the success of ExxonMobil and Sakhalin-1 in Russia's Far East, and the continued presence of U.S. energy services companies in Western Siberia and in the Volga-Urals. But there's been less than hoped for, despite strong interest shown by American companies in this area. We continue to work with our partners to convey the message that despite continued strong economic growth, Russia needs to look to the long term and work with far greater urgency to attract investment into its energy sector in order to reverse production growth stagnation. Greater U.S. investment in this sector would be a win-win outcome for both countries. American companies have the capital and high technology Russia needs to exploit many of its oil and gas fields. This is increasingly important as Russia's new fields are located in remote areas, like the Arctic, Eastern Siberia, and the Far East, and many future fields will be offshore. Although the investment climate has improved on some fronts, investment in energy is still a mixed bag, rife with uncertainties. Overall, many structural improvements remain necessary. Judicial reform to strengthen rule of law, banking reform to improve the capacity of the financial sector, accounting reform to promote greater transparency and integration into international business standards, improve corporate governance, and reduction of government bureaucracy. Improving the investment climate will establish a strong basis for long-term economic growth, both in the energy and in the non-energy sectors. The US government does not support monopolies or cartels. We believe in free markets for energy and transport of oil and gas. And across the board, we encourage further investment to expand production and transport options. Countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia have significant resources and are helping to provide more product to market, particularly in Europe. America's Eurasian energy security policy promotes diversification, and that includes efforts to advance reliable, long-term flows of natural gas from the Caspian region to European markets. Reliability requires sustained investment, multiple sources of energy imports, and multiple pipeline routes. These points are not new. They were endorsed by all G8 heads of state during their summit in Russia last July, when leaders committed to the St. Petersburg energy security principles, including development of transparent, efficient, and competitive energy markets. During the last US-European Union summit, the United States and the European Commission pledged to seek diversification of energy types, sources, and supply routes, with a particular focus on the Caspian region as a key source of diversified supplies of oil and natural gas. Now this month, the presidents of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan issued a declaration pledging to cooperate on increasing natural gas exports from Central Asia to Russia. This declaration attracted considerable attention and, I think, misplaced speculation in the press. But in reality, the three presidents' statements need have no direct impact on our effort to develop multiple gas pipeline routes from the Caspian region to Europe. The president's statements are not surprising. It points up the fact that the Caspian region is ripe for further development. For us in Europe, the key question is what form this further development will take. Clearly, Russia is going to be a major player in Central Asia's energy sector. But we believe that Central Asian countries would be wise to count more than one customer. Before summing up, let me mention briefly one last issue, lurking over not just our relations with Russia, but also Europe's relations with Russia, and that is Kosovo, an issue where so far there isn't much cooperation, but there also isn't yet complete disagreement. Stability in Kosovo and elsewhere in Southeast Europe has been a joint project among Russians, Europeans, and Americans for over a decade, and a successful one at that. Now, the UN Security Council must exercise its responsibility for international peace and security, looking at the fact that the parties are irreconcilable about Kosovo's status and that President Ahtisaari has presented a compelling compromise. We hope that Russia will support the draft resolution we and the Europeans have presented, in fact, today, to establish international supervision of Kosovo in its transition to independence. We see Kosovo as sui generis, a set of circumstances not found in any other conflict. And we also hope that Russia does not invoke Kosovo as a basis for intervention in other places along its borders, for that would be a most dangerous game to play. Kosovo is an issue of utmost importance to us and to Europe. We and our allies have troops on the ground, and we host refugees desiring to return home. The time, however, has come to move forward with a resolution to the final piece of the Balkan puzzle. While we understand Russian reluctance to embrace the way forward, we also expect Russia not to impose continued stagnation on Kosovo. The answer to this test may be forthcoming over the next few days. So as you can see, our relations with Russia cannot be simplified to a soundbite. I certainly haven't done that here today, and it's why I've spoken at great length. Our relations with Russia are complicated and multidimensional. They include areas of solid cooperation, such as counterterrorism, good collaboration, such as nuclear cooperation. They also include, unfortunately, areas where we have strong disagreements, such as democracy, human rights, Russia's relations with its neighbors, and missile defense. And then there are the areas in the middle, such as energy security. So with apologies for going on so long, let me now turn it over to you and to your questions, and let me thank you for your kind attention.
Well, we certainly thank you. Bob Friedman, who is a student of Soviet affairs, is in the front row, and Bob is known as being very careful and trying to be comprehensive in looking at all aspects of a question. And this was a wonderful presentation in terms of outlining the detailed complexity of our relations with Russia. We thank you for that and for your directness in doing so. Floor is open for questions. Yes, sir, in the rear, Mr. Smore. The general question, of course, is aren't some of the wishes which we have for Russia and some of our actions capable of being interpreted as threats to Russia? And then more specifically, have you considered placing our missile defensive system within Russia and therefore indicating great cooperation with them?
Thank you for the question. Enlargement of NATO, I would argue, has been a very positive development. We have not pushed NATO membership on countries that don't want it. Joining NATO means meeting performance-based criteria, and all the new members of NATO have, in fact, done so. The fact that some of these new members used to be part of, well, at least we didn't recognize the Baltic states as being part of the Soviet Union, but part of the former Soviet Union, I think does pose some challenges for Russia. But we have to recognize that these are independent sovereign states with a right to choose whatever organizations they wish to. And I think there has been some difficulty in Moscow in accepting that. In elections, we support the principle of free and fair elections. And we were not responsible for the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We were not responsible for the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Those were indigenous movements. We stood by the principle. In Ukraine in 2004, we spoke out and said that we could not accept as legitimate the election results that the government tried to put forward, which in effect were an effort to steal the election. We demanded that the government in Ukraine in 2004 respect each and every vote the Ukrainians cast. And what happened in Ukraine was that hundreds of thousands of people turned out into the streets in a very peaceful protest and demanded that their vote be counted and respected. So those events along Russia's borders have happened on their own volition. In terms of missile defense, there are people more experts certainly than I who know the best locations to put our interceptor missiles and our radar sites. And the experts on this have determined that Poland is the best place for the interceptor missiles and the Czech Republic for the radar. And that's for dealing with a threat that would come from the Middle East, say Iran, that might be projected toward either Western Europe or, in fact, the United States. In terms of working with the Russians, that was the purpose of Secretary Gates' visit. That was also part of Secretary Rice's visit. That has been part of consultations and discussions we've had with the Russians for more than a year. And so far, the Russians have been less interested in exploring these areas of cooperation and collaboration and more interested in the rhetoric. President Bush himself extended this offer to cooperate and to share technology with Russia when he spoke with President Putin in a recent phone call. We will continue to try to work with Russia in dispelling misunderstandings about what's going on. But in reality, I do think 10 interceptor missiles in Poland is no threat to Russia. It is not designed to even counter a threat from Russia. It is designed to counter a threat of maybe 1, 2, 3 missiles that might be launched from the Middle East. And on the question of Canada and Mexico, or you didn't mention Mexico, but I've heard others mention, what if the Russians wanted to put a radar in Mexico and interceptor missiles in Canada? Canada and Mexico are independent sovereign states. And if Russia and Canada and Mexico wanted to do that, that would be their right to do it. We might question it. We might have some rhetoric. There might be rhetoric coming from us too, but there's been no interest expressed by either Canada or Mexico to work with Russia on setting up such sites. And I think it's a bit of a hypothetical because Canada is also a member of NATO. And I don't imagine that there would be any interest in doing that.
Professor Friedman makes the point that the presentation has balanced pros and cons of our relations with Russia. And he asks whether, with respect to Iran and Lebanon, the Russians might be more cooperative or less. There are opportunities for both. And then secondly, would he make a comment about the direction of this balance?
And also sanctions on Iran and Bashir.
Specifically,
yes. Let me just, on the broader point, if I may, Professor, the balanced view and the trends. I certainly did try to convey that there are positives in the relationship and there are negatives. But also, let me be clear, there are some negatives that are going continuously in the wrong direction, internally in Russia and on some foreign policy issues. There are also some positives on the nuclear cooperation side, counterterrorism, that tend to maintain a positive momentum. And so maybe that's a balance. Sometimes I think the scales get a little tilted one way or the other. On sanctions with Iran, if you'll indulge me, a metaphor I would use is that a couple of years ago, we in Russia, when it came to Iran, were reading from a different book. And then a few years ago, we started to read from the same book, occasionally even from the same chapter, maybe not always chapter 7. But we were maybe a few pages ahead of Russia when it came to dealing with Iran and sanctions. But then I think starting last summer, caught up, fell behind a few pages again, but then we caught up in December when we had the first resolution. I think now we're clearly in the same chapter. And sometimes we're almost on the same page in the book dealing with Iran. And that is in large part due to the behavior of the Iranian regime and to the Iranian president's continued rejection and disrespect for Russian efforts to find solutions to dealing with the Iran nuclear problem. We have supported Russian efforts to broker an arrangement by having the highly enriched uranium returned to Russia. And Iran stiffed the Russians. Iran simply has not been interested in pursuing a cooperative path to dealing with this problem. And I think that has actually led to the Russians being on almost the same page with us. On Bashir, I think that has maybe something to do with money. I think it's also a way to send a message to Tehran. On Lebanon and the Middle East, perhaps more broadly, this is an issue that we are pushing the Russians on. We think it's been extremely important to get the tribunal going. And Russia has a relationship with Syria that we do not. And we hope that Russia will use that relationship with Syria in a positive way to encourage cooperation. And we hope that that will be true on Russian policy toward the Middle East as a whole.
Would you comment on the Soviets' remaining nuclear arsenal and the degree to which they're protected?
The issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear material, fissile material, is a major issue for our relationship. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program is focused on this very issue. But it's an issue that requires cooperation between our two governments. We have, I think, accomplished a great deal over the years. Enough? No, absolutely. But we also work closely with the Russians on improving security over nuclear facilities, guarding of nuclear weapons sites. But the Russians also do have a certain level of pride where they feel they have sufficient control over a lot of these facilities and over these weapons. So the Russians aren't simply going to open the doors to us and let us destroy whatever we deem to be appropriate. This requires cooperation and collaboration with the Russians. In terms of weapons slipping out, fortunately, none that we're aware of. And we work very closely with the Russians on the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism to ensure that something like that doesn't happen. If you remember in the campaign in 2004, both President Bush and Senator Kerry mentioned nuclear terrorism as the gravest threat to the United States. That remains the case. We work hard and closely, not only with Russia, but with other countries in the world on this initiative to ensure that nuclear weapons don't fall into the hands of terrorist groups.
How do you and your colleagues at the State Department feel about the Russian treatment of Muslims within Chechnya, and whether we've expressed sufficient rage.
There have been two tragic wars in Chechnya, the first in recent times. 1994 was the first one, ended in 1996, and then 1999 was the start of the second. And the second one actually hasn't fully finished. The first one ended in 1996 with the Khasavyurt agreement, but it didn't really, in a sustainable way, end the first war in Chechnya. And so a few years later, there was renewed fighting and violence, and war resumed. We have, over the years, expressed serious concerns about violations of human rights, about disappearances, kidnappings, torture, murders committed by Russian federal forces, by Chechen government forces, as well as by the rebels, and there have also been terrorist incidents that have been committed there. Chechnya has been, I think, an area of great tragedy over the past decade plus, where tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, and thousands, tens of thousands have been displaced. The situation there today is different than it was a few years ago. The level of fighting has subsided. The federal forces have turned over control to the local government, but the leader of the local government is someone who has himself been charged with human rights abuses, Ramzan Kadyrov. We have serious concerns about his ability to lead that region in a way that would respect human rights of the population. The other part I would just say is that we have concern not only about what's been happening in Chechnya, but in the entire North Caucasus. There is the potential for growing instability there because of economic dislocation, unemployment, and other problems, as well as treatment by the government of the populations. So this is an area where we have tried to devote some assistance resources, but it's an area where we have difficulty, quite frankly, traveling. The security situation there still does not allow us to maintain a visible presence.
It has reached and passed slightly 10 after 7, our closing time. It's been a marvelous evening. We've learned a lot, I know, and our only regret is that we have to end it. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you.